So now we are ready to put our skin tones over our color correctors. So the very first thing you're going to do is you're going to select colors that are close to your skin tone, but they may not be exact. What you have to remember is that the color that you're starting with is not the same as the color that you'd be starting with if you were just putting on your foundation, right? So none of these three colors are my exact undertones. So if I just take my regular foundation and I put that on top, it may not match the color correctly. So it's important to kind of sort of like I think about it in a way I'm like deconstructing the colors. So I'm going to find something that I feel like is close to me. I'm going to test it and see. Again, you really don't know until you get a color on your skin how it is really going to look. So it's important. Again, you want to make sure that you're cleaning your supplies in between since you're scooping out of different palettes. I'm still working with Dermacolor, so it is possible to use other products over this, but I'm kind of keeping it all in the same family just because I feel like it's a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to try this shade that is a little bit lighter um, than what the color corrector color is that I have as far as the peach goes. And technically in that family, it's like one shade down. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to apply it directly on top of it. So I did not put any powder down yet, but I just want to see how this color is going to look. And then kind of looking at like the red tone, you can kind of see that it's a little bit too like reddish and it's a little bit too like warm. So I'm actually going to use something that's a little bit like grayer as well and mix it into the skin tone just to kind of help almost like neutralize the color correctors, because what you end up having to do a lot of the times when you are doing tattoo cover is we actually have to neutralize our color correctors once they're on. So this one is still looking like a little bit orangey on me, so that's why I went for something that was a little bit cooler. I'm not necessarily going to take like pure blue and put that over it, but I just want to see what happens when I add something that sort of has that kind of like cool blue undertone to it, and see if that helps to kind of tone this down. Because as you can see, the longer this is on my skin, it is kind of oxidizing a little bit. It's getting a little bit orangier, so I'm going to have to do a little bit more work to kind of get this into a place where you wouldn't be able to see it. So this grayish color, it is helping tone it a little bit, but I really don't think it is doing as much as I'm going to need it to. So I'm definitely going to need something lighter to go over this, just because this is definitely not close enough to my skin tone. Again, it's better than the other two, and probably better than where I would be if I was just using the other two. But I definitely can tell that at this point, if I really want this to blend into my skin, I'm gonna need to use something a little bit lighter. So I'm gonna pull this color that looks almost white. It's not, this is actually my regular highlighter color that I use. It's sort of like a yellowish white. So I'm gonna use this and I am going to kind of mix it with what I already have on there. So I like to use this palette paper just because I am a notorious like mixer of colors. I don't like to use just one, and this way I can kind of spread everything out. So I'm just going to take this lighter color with just a little bit of the other one that I had already on the palette and put that over it. But they're all going to start to mix together on my skin. And then you're really going to be able to see at this point, it's going to start getting a lot closer to my skin tone. So if I was really far away from someone, just this one color over this would probably make it look like my tattoo is totally gone. The closer you are to it, and again, that's not as obvious on camera, but the closer you are to it, the more you can tell it's still a little bit off. Um, but it is definitely far closer than what it was before we had this color over it. You can see that color naturally is lighter than what my actual skin tone is, but when it's rubbed in a little bit and it has that sort of like neutral gray layer underneath it, it comes really close to what my natural skin tone is. So it's almost like you're trying to figure out what colors you can put together in order to make your skin tone. So it's sort of like if you, because everybody's skin, like we all have so many different colors in it, so you sort of have to think of it like if I were to like take apart all the different colors in my skin tone, um, how would they kind of come apart? Like what colors would make it up? And that's kind of how I figure out what kind of colors I'm going to use when I am doing tattoo cover. Um, so I'm going to keep trying to like blend this part over it. And you can see it's getting pretty close to my skin tone. It's still kind of like a blob of makeup at this point, so we obviously have a lot more blending. But you can see with using and starting with that color corrector that was a lot closer to my natural skin tone, I am far closer to having this tattoo covered than I'm going to be once I start adding skin tone color over the red and over the orange. Um, because when you work over these more extreme colors, a lot of times it just tends to kind of like mix in with those colors. But when I layer something that's already kind of skin tone, they just don't mix as much. And then I'm gonna start blending it a little bit more. So this brush that I have, it is technically like a blending eyeshadow brush, but I really love it to stipple color on when I'm doing tattoo cover. I feel like it kind of adds like texture back into the skin. Like it almost makes it look like it have like you have pores, which is really important because you don't want to just look like you have like a blob of makeup on. And this really helps to kind of like soften those edges. So a brush like this is really great too if you're working on somebody else and you can't use your fingers to blend it in. So I really recommend something like this if you do find yourself doing a lot of tattoo cover. Otherwise, just make sure your hands are sanitary when you're blending in. So now we're going to go in and we are going to try to continue covering this and start going over some of the other colors. So you can see I'm going to start mixing them a little bit because if I just put that really light color over these other two shades that are on my arm, it's just going to turn into like kind of like a pastel version of it because these two colors really do need to be um, neutralized before I can put anything on it. So again, this is why I really do like to have this palette paper. I like to work on gray so that I have like a neutral background. And then I also like to test once I do mix up a color, because like I said, I mix up a lot of colors. I like to test it off to the side just so that way, if I get it on my skin and I realize it's really, really wrong, it doesn't interfere or like mess up any of the makeup that I already had on. So again, just keep making sure when you're applying more makeup on it that your edges are soft. Um, Really, at this point, like if I was gonna be far away, it is pretty good, and I don't think anyone would see it from stage. But let's see how, with our other two color correctors, let's see how it goes trying to cover these up. So for these two, I'm going to grab a little bit more of this like peachy shade and kind of mix it into this lightest color just because I think this lightest color on its own, if I was trying to go over these two, it's probably not going to work that great. So we do have to be careful with that just because, as you'll probably see, it's going to have a tendency to just sort of like mix and turn into other colors or kind of turn into like pastels or whatever it may be. Um, so always when you're mixing, try to like move the colors back and forth because that's going to kind of get like the pigments evenly distributed throughout the whole thing. And then again, when you're pressing the color on, just like we put the color corrector on, you're going to be pressing it into your skin, not wiping it. That's especially important when you're going over the color corrector, just because the color corrector is really going to mix and kind of get everywhere. And you can see by doing this, it really is starting to mix, even with me just dabbing over it. So this is a time where probably if I put like a little bit of powder over it, that would certainly help that. But this definitely shows you the difference between starting with a color corrector that is really close to skin tone and starting with one that is far from what my skin tone is. Um, Definitely the one just looks like a big blob on my arm compared to the other one that is virtually kind of gone. So we're going to go ahead just because we can already see that this is going to be a problem. Let's add some of this powder over it. So this is the waterproof setting powder that Dermacolor makes. It is not a totally colorless one. They do make one that's totally colorless, but I found that I like to work with powders that match people's undertones because it seems to oxidize a little bit less and it can also help with like further color correction within your tattoo cover. So I'm just going to stipple like a light layer of it on. I don't want to totally cake it because if you cake too much powder on, it can get kind of like crusty and it can make it hard to layer all of your colors. So you want to put enough powder to kind of lock it in, but we don't necessarily want to put so much that it's going to add even more texture. And so now we can start going over it and you're going to see that it will still mix a little bit, but it's a little bit better than if we had just applied the color straight over it like we did with the red. And surprisingly enough, the orange is actually covering a little bit better than what the red is. So that one would probably be my next one to disappear. For some reason on me today, that red is not having it. But you can definitely see still though that peachy color, it's way closer to what my skin tone is. And would probably just make my life a lot easier if I were to do this kind of a tattoo cover on myself or with someone with as pale skin as me to continue um, using that as the color corrector instead of trying to make one of these other harsh ones work. So again, I'm going to take a little bit more of this like neutralish grayish kind of tone and try to just get this orange to like calm down a little bit. Um, and that's something that if you do use a color corrector that's closer to your skin tone or closer to the skin tone of who you're working on, you may not have to do as much with that step just because if you're already starting close to skin tone, there isn't necessarily a color that you're gonna need to neutralize out. So that's why, and like I talked about in my other videos too, I don't necessarily like to use the really extreme color correctors because I feel like, great, I color corrected, like I got rid of the blue, but now I'm orange. So I would rather like color correct my blue and just be slightly like peachy and then be able to take care of that instead of turning myself a completely different color and then having to go back and neutralize that. So basically now it's kind of just like going back and forth, mixing different colors. So I've got it like probably at least like 4 different colors in this, honestly. Um, and you kind of just keep patting the color on. Again, you don't want to be wiping it. Sometimes when you're blending out the edges, you kind of like pull and wipe that a little bit, but if you wipe over where the tattoo is or where the bruise is or whatever it is that you're covering or whatever it is that you're covering, a lot of times you just pull the makeup back off, and it's really important to let the makeup kind of like stay where it is. Otherwise, you're just gonna have to keep layering it, and after a while, it just gets kind of muddy, and your skin can really only accept so much makeup. So again, and you can see the way I'm doing it, you just want to be patting it on. That is like one of the biggest things I see with tattoo covers. I feel like people don't apply it correctly just because I think we're used to just kind of like watching videos where people just kind of like wipe it on and it's perfect. But that's really not how it is. Also, patting it on like this is going to help you kind of cover up a little bit more texture too, because you're going to kind of get all the different um, angles of it that you wouldn't necessarily get if you're just like wiping clean over it. So you can see the more I add this little like mixture of colors that I made, it's getting a little bit better. Still that red shade on me though, it is pretty vibrant compared to the other two. So you can see again, that peachy shade really is gonna be kind of like my best match, my best bet. I'm sure if I sat here and worked um, for a little bit longer, I would be able to get the other two perfect. But again, especially when we're working in theater, which is like what the purposes of this class are, you don't always have that much time. So I really recommend kind of doing things the easiest way for you. So our next step is going to be adding in a little bit of powder. I like to use powder puffs. I've found that using a brush, I don't get enough powder into it when I'm doing tattoo cover, and I found that with disposable sponges, I don't know if that was making my makeup oxidize, but I feel like it oxidizes a lot less when I powder it with a powder puff. So when you are using this particular powder, this waterproof powder that Krylon makes, you have to layer on quite a bit of it. So this is going to be a lot more powder than you're maybe used to putting on your own face. Um, so don't be afraid to powder. I think people are really scared. I usually tell people if you think that you don't have, and like if you think there's too much powder, you probably need a little bit more with this. You are recommended to leave this powder on like 15 minutes to make it as like waterproof as possible. I usually do it for a couple of minutes because in reality we don't have that kind of time. But you want to let it sit in there because it's when this powder kind of meets with that makeup that is what is going to make it waterproof. Um, so I really love this powder. However, really any powder would work. You don't have to buy like a special powder. But if you do need something that's waterproof, this is a great option to go with. It comes in a lot of different tints. I don't recommend the colorless unless you are extremely pale, just because I do think it makes it a little bit chalky, and I've had the most issues with the colorless actually like oxidizing and altering the color. So again, so we're gonna apply it with a powder puff. I'll usually use a brush though to kind of like brush it back off, just because I feel like knocking it off with a powder puff, like I'd be afraid that I would kind of like smear the makeup off a little bit. So I'll usually just take like a larger, like fluffy brush, and kind of go in and brush it back off. But once you remove the powder, you should be able to like submerge it in water or have someone spray you with water, and it will not alter the makeup. So obviously, I'm not going to leave it on for enough time to get the most waterproof effect in the world, since this is just for a quick demo, but just so that you can see. What if you did use this like Dermacolor fixing powder, kind of what the effect would be. You can use this to set regular foundation. I've used it like on people's legs before and they're like, oh, this makeup has stayed on forever. So setting it with powder is really important. If you're using a tattoo cover that doesn't need to be set with powder, then obviously you could skip this step. But I do recommend at least using like a setting spray with it. If you're not going to use any kind of powder, even for something that's self-setting, I do think setting sprays are a really good idea. So again, so we've probably given enough time that I can kind of go in and knock it off with this brush. So this is just to get rid of any extra powder that you don't necessarily want on there. And so you can see sometimes the powder will kind of change the color of it a little bit. It didn't do too much this time, but definitely the peachy spot is still the best one. The orange one is the next, and that red really did not take that well to my skin. So hopefully you can kind of see like through this demo, um, just how many different options you really do have with color correcting, and that you can still arrive at like the same outcome, with going through things with like different methods. There's just some things that might make things a little bit simpler for you as opposed to others. Um, if you notice that you do have that little like ring around the tattoo, sometimes I'll go back and wipe that off before I set it. But for right now, I'm just going to spray it with a little bit of water. It's not the most set thing in the world, but you should be able to see the water kind of like beat up on my arm, and then I'll be able to wipe it, and you won't see any of the makeup come off. So, again, this wasn't sitting for the total recommended time, so it's not going to be perfect. I've never done this on a temporary tattoo, so we'll see. It's a little tricky to see, but hopefully you can kind of see up close. You can see how it beads up instead of penetrating the makeup. That's why this powder is awesome. I love that. If you're outside in the rain, it'll do the same thing on your face if you have your face set with this powder. So it's really great. You can run your hand over it, or you can run like a tissue over it, and you're not going to see any makeup come off of it. Um, if you actually let it sit for the full amount of time, it really won't be disturbed, but you can see just kind of rubbing it a little bit. Really didn't do too much, and it probably only sat there for like 2 or 3 minutes at most. So imagine if you left it for the full 15, it would really do a pretty good job of setting it in. Um, and so you obviously want to dry it off before you would like put your costume on, but you can kind of see, if you look at the tissue, that there's really like no makeup came off with it, and that is a pretty rare thing to do with most makeup. So your final step would definitely be to spray some kind of setting spray. They do make one, Dermacolor. There is like a special Krylon Dermacolor setting spray. I don't have it. I have a Mayron one, and then I have another one by Krylon. I like aerosol ones better, because I feel like I can get like a more even coverage for this kind of a thing. But whatever you do, make sure you set it. It's really important. Even if you like powdered it really well, just put that final layer of setting spray over it, just because um, without that, if you're like changing or whatever it might be, because if you're in theater and you're covering it, you're probably gonna have to change costumes. You don't want your clothing to kind of like wipe it off. So when you have to remove it at the end of the day, if you use something oily, even just like soap and water, anything that's not just water alone will help you take it off. I usually go for like an oilier makeup remover, um, but as long as you use something other than water, if you use like a waterproof powder like I did, it's going to remove really easily.